international trade. Welcome to everyone. I need to get the committee to adopt a study budget for C18. You've all received a copy of the study budget yesterday for a cost of $4,250. Could we adopt this motion before we start? All those in favor, opposed, it's carried. There you go, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair. All right, pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, February 2nd, 2026, the committee is resuming its study on Bill C-18, an act to implement the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Canada and Indonesia. We have with us as witnesses today, as an individual, Ian Lee, Associate Professor, Sprott School of Business, Carleton University, by video conference, and Atkins Reales, Jason Easton, Global Head of Government Relations, Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, Michael Harvey, Executive Director. Welcome to all of you. Welcome back to the committee, certainly for some of you. And we will start with Mr. Lee with a presentation of up to 5 minutes, please. You'll have to unmute yourself, sir. Oh, you're not unmuted, Mr. There you go. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the invitation on this extremely important subject. First, my disclosures. Number one, I do not belong to or donate money to any political party. Two, I am not a registered lobbyist, as I do not consult to any industry. The views I am presenting today and in my media interviews are based on extensive analysis of trade stats of the Canadian government, the American government, and international government agencies such as the IMF and the WTO. Three, I've taught the strategy and policy capstone course over 100 times in developing countries since 1990 in the former Soviet Union, Central East Europe, including multiple times in Russia, Ukraine, Poland since 1991, Romania since 1993, Czech Republic, as well as China since 1997, and 10 times over 10 years in Iran, and Cuba 8 times. Number four, I've been a member of the University Faculty Union for 38 years, meaning I am unionized. Over my entire career, analyzing company and industry competitiveness, first as a banker for 9 years lending money to SMEs, and the last 35 years teaching and researching strategy, I've studied trade theory and trade trend data extensively to understand what Adam Smith called the wealth of nations. Those who actually examine trade theory and trade stats have known for 250 years since Adam Smith that the prosperity of a country is not due to a mercantilist belief in the amount of gold in the central bank vaults, nor is it because the gods of some religion or another decided they liked one nationality or religion over another and made them wealthier. These were two of the dominant theories at the time of Adam Smith in the 1700s. Smith argued trade is essential to prosperity. It's not an add-on, which is due to the production and exchange of goods and services within a country and with other countries. Because trade theory of comparative advantage, which put in my language is simply make and trade what you're good at, was developed 250 years ago by Smith and refined by David Ricardo. But some critics argue it's not relevant anymore. This ignores the most important trade theorist of the last 75 years, Paul Krugman, who did win a Nobel Prize for his work showing why trade is mutually advantageous due to specialization from scale economies, even when nations have similar advantages. Today, these theories are under attack from both the extreme right, Trump and tariff advocates, and some on the left who view Trump as the opportunity to promote protectionism and restrictive trade policies. However, the evidence-based graphs from the WTO, the OECD, UNCTAD, the World Bank, and other international bodies reveal that the 38 high-income countries, that's the World Bank's phrase, the OECD countries, trade substantially more as a percentage of GDP than most low or middle-income countries. In other words, they're much wealthier, they're much more successful, they trade a lot more. Those who actually study empirical trends recognize that the autarkic policies of protectionism are designed to keep out foreign products and services in support of local industry and firms that consequentially drives down our productivity, stifles innovation, and increases prices to consumers, as the brilliant economist Joseph Schumpeter showed us some 50 years ago. Fortunately, starting in 1945, following the disastrous beggar thy neighbor depression, and of course the ruinous Second World War, we developed the GATT that was transformed into the WTO. Over the last 75 years, WTO countries successively reduced tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So what happened? OECD trade exploded. Prosperity exploded. GDP per person increased year after year. OECD countries today are vastly more prosperous in 2025 on a per person annual income basis than in 1960. This brings us to the current urban legend of the death of globalization, seen in multiple op-eds in Canada, US, and EU, one in the Toronto Star only this last 5 days, claiming globalization is, quote, dead, which means each country will stop trading with other countries. Does anyone believe that Canada will become autarkic like North Korea and will start to grow blueberries in Ottawa in January, presumably in snowbanks? Because if we stop trading, and why on earth do we care about the Chinese manufacturing 1.2 trillion export surplus or China's 60% world market share of EVs if globalization really is dead? This is why I profoundly disagree with both Prime Minister Carney and former Prime Minister Harper. I respect both of them enormously concerning a radical rupture in the world trade paradigm that has governed the world since 1950. The very distinguished Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB and the former president of the IMF, sharply disagreed with Prime Minister Carney, as did the current head of the IMF. And please see the Brugge. Yes.
I actually am very anxious for you to finish it, but I have to go on to the other witnesses, and hopefully you can complete that excellent presentation through some of our members that will no doubt want to hear the next steps that you have thought out better than.
Okay. I understand.
Committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Jason Easton. I'm Global Head of Government Relations at AtkinsRéalis, a Canadian engineering services and nuclear company with deep roots in this country and a strong global footprint. AtkinsRéalis emploie 41,000 personnes à travers le monde.
AtkinsRéalis employs 41,000 persons worldwide, including 8,000 in Canada. We deliver complex infrastructure, energy, and defense projects in more than 50 countries. And we have a long history of supporting Canada's commercial, climate, and strategic objectives.
Which would implement the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Canada and Indonesia. From our perspective, this agreement represents an important step forward to strengthen Canada's economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, a region that will drive global growth, infrastructure demand, and energy transition for decades to come. Indonesia is a particularly important partner. It's the world's fourth most populous country, a G20 member, and a nation with ambitious plans for infrastructure expansion, industrial development, energy transition, and energy security. Meeting those objectives will require trusted international partners, advanced technology, and long-term collaboration, areas where Canadian firms are well positioned to contribute. From an industry standpoint, CIPA has the potential to improve market access, regulatory transparency, and investment certainty for Canadian companies operating there. These are not abstract concepts. For companies like AtkinsRéalis, clear rules, predictable procurement frameworks, strong government-to-government relationships, these all directly influence whether Canadian expertise is brought to bear on major projects or whether those opportunities are captured by competitors from other jurisdictions. I would like to highlight one particular sector of strategic relevance, nuclear energy. Indonesia has publicly signaled its interest in diversifying its energy mix, reducing emissions, and strengthening long-term energy security. As electricity demand grows and the considerations for energy security and net zero objectives converge, nuclear energy is increasingly part of serious policy discussions across Southeast Asia, where Indonesia is a leading voice. Canada has a unique offering in the space through its own homegrown nuclear technology in CANDU. CANDU reactors are proven, safe, and well-suited to countries seeking reliable baseload, strong non-proliferation credentials, and flexibility and security in fuel supply, given that they use natural, non-enriched uranium. They also offer significant opportunities for long-term partnerships in engineering services, life cycle support, workforce training, and regulatory cooperation, areas where Canadian expertise is globally recognized. Finally, as Canada pursues ambitious export objectives, seeking to double overseas exports by $300 billion. The opportunities for Canada's nuclear supply chain are immense. The Conference Board of Canada forecasts that each new CANDU deployed overseas will increase Canadian GDP by about $5 billion, increase federal tax revenues by $1.6 billion, and support 36,000 full-time jobs. Trade agreements like CIPA do not, on their own, however, deliver projects, but they create the enabling environment in which Canadian technologies such as CANDU can be credibly advanced, supported by strong diplomatic relationships and clear commercial frameworks. In this sense, Bill C-18 should be viewed not only as a trade instrument, but as part of Canada's broader economic and strategic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. I would also note that trade agreements are increasingly evaluated not only on commercial outcomes, but on how they advance broader public policy objectives. A well-implemented CIPA can support stronger labor standards by enabling Canadian companies to export practices rooted in safety, skills development, and workforce training. It can reinforce environmental objectives by facilitating the deployment of low-carbon infrastructure and clean energy solutions. And it aligns with Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy by deepening long-term partnerships in a region of growing strategic importance based on rules, transparency, and trusted collaboration. In closing, AtkinsRéalis supports efforts to deepen Canada's trade and investment relationship with Indonesia in a way that is mutually beneficial, rules-based, and forward-looking. We believe Bill C-18 can help strengthen Canadian companies to compete, innovate, and contribute to sustainable development in the region while creating high-value jobs and opportunities here at home. On a personal basis, I've had the great privilege of having a front-row seat during the growth of Canada's bilateral relationship with Indonesia, and I am very pleased to support your consideration of this legislation to take Canada and Indonesia to the starting line of a new economic partnership. Thanks for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Easton. On to Mr. Harvey, please.
Bonjour et merci aux membres du comité de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui.
Good morning, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me today. The Canadian Agri-Food Alliance, CAFTA, is a coalition of national organizations that advocates for a freer and fairer international trading environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector. CAFTA members include farmers, ranchers, processors, producers, and exporters from key trade sectors such as beef, pork, grains, oilseeds, sugar, pulses, plant sciences, and soybeans. Agri-food accounts for 1 in 9 jobs in Canada, with the majority in the export-oriented agri-food sector. Canada exports approximately $100 billion worth of agricultural and food products annually. That is more than half of our agricultural production is exported or processed for export. 90% of Canadian farmers depend on trade.
And we encourage this committee to report favorably and recommend swift ratification. Indonesia represents one of the fastest growing markets in Southeast Asia, and for Canada's agri-food exporters, this CIPA has the potential to open new doors in a dynamic country that values reliable suppliers of safe, high-quality food. CAFTA has long advocated for trade agreements that provide predictable, rules-based access to high-growth markets.
Hold on, Mr. Harvey, we have a translation problem.
En fait, c'est qu'on entend deux voix en même temps qui font l'interprétation. Il y a comme une superposition qui rend la chose inaudible.
We are hearing 2 voices at the same time during the interpretation.
Should be all right.
All right, we're good to go. My apologies, Mr. Harvey. Please
Oh, that's
continue.
fine. Is it okay now?
Yes, it is.
We're not, c'est pas double voix. Sorry, it's okay now? Yeah. CAFTA has long advocated for trade agreements that provide predictable, rules-based access to high-growth markets. This agreement's commitments on agri-food, food security, and trade facilitation reflect the strong complementarities between Canada and Indonesia, and we look forward to working with government and industry partners to ensure these provisions translate into real opportunities for Canadian exporters. This agreement also reinforces Canada's broader engagement in the Asia-Pacific, including the ongoing Canada-ASEAN FTA negotiations and Indonesia's interest in joining the CPTPP. Together, these efforts will help Canadian agri-food exporters diversify markets, strengthen supply chain resilience, and contribute to economic growth. CAFTA and its members stand ready to continue collaboration and engagement with Indonesia through the agreement's mechanisms to facilitate agri-food trade and to continue working with government to advance an ambitious, comprehensive trade strategy that ensures Canada places agri-food trade at the heart of our international agenda. Il me fera plaisir de répondre à toutes vos questions. Merci.
Questions from our members. Mr. Chambers, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lee, you were on a roll, and I'll remind, maybe I'll jog your memory. The Prime Minister gave a very, it was a good speech in terms of it was well researched, it was well argued, but I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your impression of the speech about there being a rupture and we're never going back to rules-based trade, what say you?
Unmute yourself, please. Mr. Lee, hold your voice. Press the button. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, my apologies. Thank you for the question. And it was a very, very fine speech. My only disagreement is this idea that's very popular today that, you know, we're not going back, or the trading is going to diminish, or it's going to eventually die, maybe, or disappear. And the stats simply do not support that. And I'm not using 10 or 20-year-old stats. Bruegel, the European think tank, very prestigious, has the publication out only 7 days ago. I urge every member to read it, showing the very, very, very latest graph, showing the Chinese exports are up, Europe's exports are up, everyone's exports are up, as are imports. So that denies or contradicts the claim that there's been this rupture. Yes, there's been a shift in the trade. We can see that trade from China to the U.S. is down, but then Mexican trade to the U.S. and Vietnam to the U.S. is up. So there are shifts going on. And yes, the great powers have become more mercantilist, but we are still going to have a world that is based profoundly on global trade, imports and exports around the world. That is not going to come to an end.
And in terms of Canada's place in the world with our trading relationships, my sense is you would agree that we need trading relationships. We need more than we have today. We need to strengthen the ones we currently have. Is it just to believe that we would be able to move on in this world without the United States?
I cannot, under any analysis of any set of numbers, find that credible. I've looked at what I call pairs, you know, Poland and Germany. Well, they've been trading with each other for hundreds of years, even though Germany did horrible things to Poland, 1939 to 1945, and yet that's their largest trading partner today. You know, you look at Argentina and Chile, or Argentina and Brazil. It's the propinquity, or the geographic advantage that you're right next door. You're joined at the hip. We have 800 billion in bilateral trade, and the idea that we can somehow pick that up and put it on a boat or an airplane and send it halfway around the world, I think is naive in the extreme. It doesn't mean that a new CUSMA isn't going to be different. I think it's going to be a very different CUSMA. But if I can remind everybody of Kissinger's, very quickly, Kissinger's great line on this. He said, nations do not have friends. They have interests, and it's the role of the leadership of every country to determine the interests of their country. And then it's like a Venn diagram. You look for there's overlapping interests between the two. And Canada and the U.S. will remain and continue to have very significant overlapping interests between our two countries.
Opinion on where you think that those strongest interests are overlapped?
I think it's going to be in natural resources and energy. I'm much more skeptical about automobiles, not because I'm anti-automobile at all, but that sector has been declining for a very long time. We do not have a competitive advantage against the United States, principally because I know people will disagree in that industry, but we are only 40 million people, smaller than California. And when you look at the global R&D costs for that industry and the global capital expenditure costs, they're staggering. 150 billion euros, which is over 200 billion annually in R&D to play in that game. I can't see any Canadian company only selling in the Canadian market that can be successful, because the scale economies are so huge. You've got to have access to either the US or the EU or China. And those two countries, the latter two, have been protecting themselves for years. And the US, as we now know, is starting to protect themselves from us as well. So it suggests that we're going to have to pivot very strongly to resources, including energy, because the world wants, as the German chancellor told us, as did the Japanese premier and the South Korean premier and the Chinese, they want our resources.
Do you think that it was a missed opportunity when those individuals came to Canada and asked for our resources, that we sent them home empty-handed saying there was no business case?
I was on the record. I did interviews on this. CBC contacted me on CTV, and I said I thought it was a horrible mistake. Because we've been blessed by luck or nature or whatever, we have trillions of dollars of resources in the ground, not just oil and gas. We have timber, we have potash, we have nuclear, we have just about everything going. And we have an enormous comparative advantage in natural resources. We do not have enormous comparative advantage in automobile production. That's why we've been pouring billions and billions into that sector from the beginning. You don't have to if you have a comparative advantage. And so we walked away as the very former prime minister was saying there was no business case. Biden, almost the very same day, you could juxtapose the two images, and he was approving LNG exports to Europe because, of course, of Putin's terrible invasion of Ukraine.
Professor Lee, I appreciate. I want to leave some time for my fellow members. I'll have to audit one of your classes, but I could talk to you all day.
Okay, thank you.
Seconds remaining. I was very happy to see you continue. I think it was fascinating to listen to Mr. Lee. Mr. Nafty, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Chambers, you and I can audit it together. Professor Lee lives in my riding. I've had an opportunity to sit down with him and benefit from his expertise, so it's always good to see him. Talking of comparative advantage, and he also mentioned nuclear in his comments. So I want to pick up the conversation with Mr. Easton on the opportunities that exist for Canadian nuclear industry and the expertise that we have developed, not just in actual reactors, but the entire supply chain that you were speaking of, and what those opportunities look like in other countries, in particularly Indo-Pacific. You touched on Indonesia, but I'm sure there's other opportunities as well that we can really make ourselves viable and create jobs here in Canada.
I was told to wait for the red light to come on. No, it's a very good question. The importance of this CIPA with Indonesia is that Indonesia is one of the largest countries in Southeast Asia. In many ways, they are the gateway to the region, and they're a huge economic player. The region is not dissimilar to any other part of the world in terms of their focus on energy security and energy transition to net zero. They are certainly at a stage of their economic development where overall emissions are quite high, but per capita emissions are quite low. So from their standpoint, they look at the developed world and they want to see us do our part as well. But in terms of our expertise in nuclear energy and clean technologies, in Canada, we do have a supply chain of more than 250 companies. They employ over 90,000 people directly and indirectly. And the opportunity in Indonesia and more broadly ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is immense. We have certainly seen interest from Indonesia in nuclear technology. We've seen interest from other countries such as Malaysia and Philippines, all as part of their net zero strategies. And they look to countries like Canada because of how we're positioned geopolitically. How our technology actually allows for energy security and fuel flexibility, given that it doesn't require enriched uranium. So there are many opportunities that we're pursuing across the region. CANDU reactors also offer the advantage of medical isotope production, concurrent or at the same time as electrical generation. And these are all opportunities that Canada can both export but support the development locally in terms of the capabilities in region that they're seeking.
So there is obviously the potential benefit of a trade agreement in terms of market access, regulatory harmonization, all those things that you were referring to. What are the other ancillary benefits of having a trade agreement with a country like Indonesia or what we focused on right now, ASEAN countries? Does that help Canadian business like AtkinsRéalis to have a competitive edge, so to speak, compared to Russians or Chinese who may be also vying for same business?
So it absolutely does. One of the things that foreign governments and companies in international markets, one of the things they look towards when AtkinsRéalis and other Canadian firms are trying to enter markets or sell products is they want to see support from their home governments. So Canada ratifying this CIPA with Indonesia is certainly a macro level demonstration of that support. It gives confidence to those businesses and government officials in Indonesia that Canada stands behind its companies, its services, its products, and it helps open doors. The CIPA in and of itself is not going to immediately increase the amount of business that Canadian companies do with Indonesia or immediately increase the amount of exports. But the wraparound activities and support that the federal government provides, either via the Trade Commissioner Service or via trade missions, all of those things combined will help companies walk through the door that CIPA is now opening for us.
Mr. Harvey, I'll come to you. Agri-food is a large export for Canada. Indo-Pacific is a growing market for Canada. What do you see this agreement accomplishing on top of what we already have in terms of relationships in Asia, in Indonesia, and then I look beyond Indonesia to ASEAN countries as well, given that we're engaged in conversations with ASEAN, with Thailand, with Philippines as well?
I think Mr. Easton just walked through the confidence building aspect, and there's really nothing to add on that. But the most important thing is just the size of Indonesia, which is 283.5 million people. I just went on the internet, maybe 500,000 since I read that. Growing rapidly growing middle class that's interested in higher quality food and has more capacity to pay for high quality food. So we're talking a big market, but we're talking a market that's growing really rapidly too.
So we often talk about food security. I've been hearing a lot about nutrition security. How does Canada play in that role, and how could an agreement like this help ensure nutrition security in countries like Indonesia?
Well, we're selling a high quality product. A product where our inspection systems are top level, where the consumer in these countries can be very clear exactly what they're getting and have confidence in that. And the other thing we can provide in food security is the fact that we're not going to, for political reasons, stop providing the product, which is a big deal with some countries in the world.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci à l'ensemble de...
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before us today, and thank you for your presentations. My first question is for Mr. Easton. Let's say that we look at actual cases. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe Atkins-Relis is going to be participating in two airport building stations, and you're also going to be involved in high-speed train projects. Is that correct? So to date, have there been regulatory hindrances preventing your participation? Are there any other issues that come into play?
Are we talking domestic or international in Indonesia?
Allez-y. Je vous écoute.
Please go ahead.
Donc l'accord vient pas lever quelque chose qui aurait pu être...
So the agreement is not going to raise any obstacles or anything that might have been a hindrance for you, or a trade barrier, something that would prevent the investments, if only because of the bureaucratic burden?
I wouldn't frame my response that way. I think the agreement itself helps make doing business with Indonesia easier in terms of bringing transparency, for example, to government procurement processes. Are there specific regulations I could point to from an engineering standpoint that might be hindrances today? Yes. Generally, though, a company the size of Atkins-Relis with global footprint, with local operations, although not in Indonesia at this time, we are able to leverage our local footprint, the communities we operate, to find a way to do business in market. But absolutely, CIPA, through the provisions that exist, whether it's temporary movement of people, whether it's regulatory cooperation, it does provide more streamlined access.
Parfait, je vous remercie.
Thank you. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Harvey. I don't think that you mentioned this in your opening remarks, but unless I'm mistaken, in this agreement, there will be new requirements that will be applied to meat coming from Indonesia. Is the industry preparing for this? Will there be any specific needs? Well, I suggest that you ask the questions to the representatives of the bovine industry who are much more familiar with this. But I know that CIPA provides for a framework, just like Mr. Easton indicated, that creates a certain level of confidence, enabling us to move forward. I was told that the negotiation of the agreement opens up doors in Indonesia. However, there are certain elements of certification that are beyond the scope of my knowledge, but perhaps I think that the members of the industry would be able to better speak to this. But perhaps if we could obtain a testimony tomorrow, that would be interesting. There's no doubt new access, but there are new conditions as well. I think it would be interesting to see what the repercussions would be for you. I am not really an expert in the details of each country. I think that's up to the experts in the country to determine. But if the members of the committee would like to hear them, that would be possible. Yes, there are people who are very familiar with this that you could hear. But beyond this, and it's always the same issue. Again, we have also looked at the study of including the UK in the CPTPP. And again, we said no tariff entry, that is fine for everybody. But there's also a means of bypassing what we don't dare to do directly, is that to establish a specific cleanliness laws, hygiene laws. In your mind, are there any and I think that the regulatory framework in your case is going well in this particular case. In terms of the non-tariff items, it will be always difficult because at the end of the day, it's all about regulation. The recommendation is managed under a legal framework, but it is also managed to the extent that it is about cooperation. There's an interesting element in this agreement. Aaron Fowler, the chief negotiator, and I imagine that he will appear here as a witness, explained to me a number of times that this agreement established that Canada wants to use a development fund in Indonesia to work with the local regulators in order to better enable them to better understand our regulatory systems in Canada. Once again, this is a measure of confidence building between both countries that should make it possible to resolve issues more quickly or to perhaps even solve them before they arise. So currently, under the current legislation or scientific or standards or Indonesian laws, you don't see any specific hindrances. What I see is that this kind of agreement enables us to move towards resolution on this site. So it is positive. Well, that's good. Now, as to the rest, on the opposite side, do you believe that in the case of Indonesia, because they don't have the same climate, no doubt you don't have the same levels of wages nor the same standards that apply. Do you see that there could be some kind of competition from their agri-food producers compared to ours? Could it be unfair competition? I'd say that it's complementarity. They do produce products that we do not produce. So generally speaking, we're not producing the same products. So their market is not at all the same. We cannot say that they'll be producing the same products simply. Well, we see that as an opportunity to export and not similar products as to the ones we produce.
Mr. Cram, please.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. I'd like to start with Professor Lee. With 280 million people, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world by population, just behind the United States. So at first glance, one might be tempted to think that our current trade problems with the United States could be solved by just doing more business with Indonesia. However, our export numbers to the two countries tell a different story. Canada exports nearly $600 billion per year to the United States, but only about $2 billion to Indonesia. So, Professor Lee, could you share your opinion with the committee about whether it's realistic to replace our trading relationship with the United States by trading more with Indonesia?
Thank you, Mr. Cram, for that question. I've never argued, and I don't believe that we can, where we have a dominant partner relationship with the U.S. We all know the numbers. About 70% of our exports go to this one country, but it's not just any old country. I just did a presentation last week before a business group showing that the U.S. is 30 trillion GDP. China, which has been predicted for, probably the last 25 years to surpass the United States, is actually the gap between China and the United States is larger today than it was 10 years ago. In other words, the United States is growing in relative terms faster than the number two country. And so we need to access that market because it's not going away. It is next door. We have a 150-year history or longer. And so all we can do is augment the market. Yes, diversification for sure. But the idea that we can displace $800 billion or a big chunk of that, I just don't find it credible.
About augmenting our exports to Indonesia then. So last year, Prime Minister Carney announced his intention to double non-U.S. exports in 10 years. That works out to about an additional $180 billion of exports to countries other than the U.S. by 2035. So, Professor Lee, in your opinion, is it realistic to achieve that goal through our new free trade agreement with Indonesia?
Probably not, because there are barriers inside our country that have been discussed. We know the barriers. We have barriers, restrictions on the infrastructure, whether it be pipelines, whether it be railroads, double tracking, twin tracking, whatever the phrase is. We're going to have to spend a lot more on infrastructure because most of our stuff, if I can call it that we want to export is not on the border, obviously, of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific. So we've got to move that stuff. Diversification means moving a lot of stuff to the two coasts to put them on ships, to send it to Europe in one direction and to Asia in the other. And we have a lot of barriers in our own country, interprovincial trade barriers. We have infrastructure barriers. And so I think we're going to have to address those issues simultaneously or concurrently with this attempt to diversify by creating a framework. I agree with the other two witnesses. This doesn't create trade diversification in and of itself. One more quick point, if I can get this out to everybody. We all talk about it as if it's a macro thing. There's somebody like in the Wizard of Oz, there's somebody behind the curtain manipulating all these exports. The prime minister's minions are saying, company A, you go there, and company B, you go there. Trade is voluntary, and it's micro, not macro. So the question is, will companies find the opportunities sufficient and the barriers can they be overcome to take advantage of these opportunities? And so there is a need for government to address the barriers and failures inside our own country first.
Look at this goal of doubling our non-U.S. exports within 10 years. Would you say that this Canada-Indonesia free trade agreement could get us halfway there or 2/3 of the way there? Or how big an impact will this free trade agreement make, do you think?
Margins, it's going to be a net benefit. I mean, I'll disclose, I have supported every trade agreement since 1988 until now. We are a small country. We like to think we're this enormous country, and we are geographically, but population-wise, we're not. We're smaller than the state of California. The GDP of Canada is smaller than the state of Texas and the state of California separately. And so small countries have to diversify and export. That's why Norway and Sweden and Denmark were at the forefront of globalization. It wasn't the big countries that started to globalize first. It was the small countries because they needed to access bigger markets. And so I'm not saying that this is a panacea. It's one ticket, one tool in a multiplicity of tools that Canada must adopt to reduce a little bit. If we can reduce our dependence by 10% in the next 10 years, that'll be major progress.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Madame Lapointe, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Bienvenue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses. You're all extremely interesting, but unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes. Mr. Harvey, I'd like to salute the International Agriculture Day. That's where we are today. I have a question for you. So CIPA, is that an agreement that meets with the sanitary and phytosanitary barriers? Sometimes we have issues with that in Europe. Yes. We're very pleased with the article stipulated in the agreement that covers the issues of biotechnology in agriculture. It's quite innovative. It is more than Indonesia has included in its agreements with other countries in previous years, and we're very pleased to see what was put on paper. So following this agreement, do you have any concerns? For instance, you say we export a great deal in soya, we export agricultural products. We're also very present in agricultural and agri-food processing. But is anything that concerns with you? Well, it's the non-tariff barriers do come up. I would say that this agreement that allows us to cooperate more with the regulatory system in Indonesia will allow us to solve a number of issues and perhaps to avoid that they arise. Thank you, Mr. Easton. Welcome to you. Thank you very much for appearing before the committee. You indicated earlier that it's important to have the correct environment so that we can develop trade agreements. And what about job opportunities? So when we signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, I was lucky to go to Malaysia, and there were some major Canadian companies that were there, including Bombardier. And at that point, they decided to withdraw from the market because they said that the regulatory framework did not protect them. Is that something that you think might occur? Because after all, you're dealing with major projects. Do you have any concerns with respect to that in this agreement?
About that in this agreement, I think with any new market the Canadian firms are entering, there is a risk analysis that we all have to undertake, both in terms of the legal framework, the regulatory framework, the anti-corruption risk, whether or not your supply chain can comply with your integrity and sustainability standards. All of those things are very important to Canadian firms and particularly important to the business we do overseas. I think one of the real advantages of an agreement like this is that it does enable us to make entries into country and export all of the practices that we hold ourselves to high standards as a company. I was on a site visit 2 weeks ago in a market that I won't identify. It's a developing market. I don't want to unnecessarily criticize another jurisdiction's safety standards, but suffice to say, they're much lower safety standards than what we would see in Canada. But AtkinsRéalis, in its management of the construction that was going on at this site, it was a mega project, was holding itself to the standards that we have in Canada. And that is a real journey to remind people to wear hard hats, to wear safety glasses, to not wear flip-flops on a construction site. And it's a continuous process of how we have to operate. So I can certainly sympathize with the experience that you relayed to us, but in terms of how AtkinsRéalis chooses to enter markets, we certainly do all of the risk analysis before going in, and then we try to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards as we operate there.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Lee, j'ai aussi une question.
Thank you. Mr. Lee, I also have a question for you. Earlier, you said that it's important to do trade where we're good in it. And you answered a question put to you by my colleague previously. This had to do about the United States, and this was all about natural resources and energy. But now we're speaking about Indonesia. Do you believe which market should we exploit and and how should we move forward?
Thank you very much. I believe that the United States is always going to be our most important market. I mean, just to state the obvious that we all know, 8,800-kilometer border. I did check that this morning. There's no country in the world other than our two that have a border that long. I won't even throw in the word undefended. Just pure geography, real estate, 8,800 kilometers. Secondly, as we know, that StatsCan has that number, 90% of us live within 150 kilometers of the U.S. border. So it's very easy to cross that border. And of course, shared language, the dominant language, of course, French is a very important language, as is Spanish in the States, but the dominant language in the States is English, the language of business. And I've certainly traveled across to just about every state in the US. So it's always going to be important. I'm not saying it's not going to be bumpy. I'm not saying that we're probably going to have to make concessions in the CUSMA agreement coming up. But in terms of ASEAN and Southeast Asia, I've been going there since 1997. And I agree with the two witnesses. There's huge opportunities there. I realize there's sensitivities, about technology and so forth.
For 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, alors,
My question will be for both of you in your areas of expertise. And earlier we spoke about standards and competition that might be similar to unfair competition, although I understand that there's a regulatory framework that is being put in place. But when it comes to environmental standards in Indonesia that are lesser than ours, and perhaps the recourse that one has to forced labor, and we've seen that as documented cases, do you believe that there could be possible unfair competition vis-a-vis you?
There's unfair competition. I think the purpose of the provisions in CIPA with respect to labor and environment are to help level that playing field and to ensure that as a minimum baseline that the markets in which we have agreements, they're being upheld to enforceable international standards or at worst enforceable domestic standards. So it is certainly a consideration for all of us as we look to enter the markets, but the agreement that's brought into place I think brings greater confidence to us that there are enforceable standards and that we can converge, I think, at a higher level and help bring both labor and environmental improvements to the market.
Dans le secteur agroalimentaire, sont vraiment pas les mêmes produits, quoi. Donc,
In the agri-food sector, the products will not be the same. There won't be many imports from Indonesia. You mean that it's not the same products? Could you perhaps speak to that a bit to allow us to better understand? Well, for example, these are tropical products. They are not products that are easy to transport here, to export to Canada. But the agreement will not lead to an increase in these products. Well, I would say that the agreement creates a framework where we can discuss these issues amongst governments, but we don't see the possibility of many products being imported from Indonesia.
La fameuse
Well, there is the palm oil production, which is considered to be very hazardous for the environment. That has led to extensive deforestation area, an area that is larger than Belgium. This was an area that was greater than Belgium that was deforested, but it's also used in cosmetics. It is also used for all kinds of things like Nutella for a number of different products. So that is documented. We know that there is violence there. We know that there are warlords involved in its production. There is environmental destruction. And
façon générale d'aborder ces questions et qu'on devrait les gérer avec
another general means of addressing these issues is that to address this beyond the frameworks of the trade agreements. These are bilateral questions to be addressed by the countries, and that the trade representatives should focus on trade.
Chair, Mr. Easton, does Atkins Real have any ongoing projects in Indonesia?
So currently today, we do not.
Previously, you worked on an airport and a high-speed rail project. Is that correct?
So I may have misunderstood the question. Apologies. Trying to get my earpiece to work. I would have to come back and actually confirm the details of that.
The details of current projects, or
well, past projects. Current projects, there are none. Past projects, I need to go. I would have to confirm.
Okay, great. One of the things that I'm concerned about, of course, is ensuring ethical functioning of Canadian companies at home and abroad. And I mean, it's no secret that your former iteration in SNC-Lavalin had problems. We'll just leave it at that. Would you commit to the committee today that any future projects in Indonesia would not directly or indirectly benefit Brookfield or any of its subsidiary companies?
I don't think I'm in the best position to be able to answer that. I think project financing around the world gets incredibly complex, and I'm not in a position where I can do that.
So you're not willing to give us that commitment? I mean, there's an obvious question that's been discussed with respect to the Prime Minister's ethical screens and his large, holdings and business dealings with Brookfield and Brookfield-related companies. So I want to know that from a company that has had its own problems with ethical business conduct around the world, which I'm happy it's reforming itself. That's good for all Canadians. But I want to make sure that we don't get into any trouble again. So I'll ask you again: Would you commit that any future projects in Indonesia, where we're opening this trade deal, don't lead to a situation where there's an entanglement between Atkins Real and companies that may indirectly or directly benefit the Prime Minister?
I think that's a very difficult question for me to answer and commit to. What I can commit to is, from an Atkins Real standpoint, we have, I think, probably some of the highest integrity measures internal to our company that you could find in any company around the world with respect to integrity and sustainability. And in all of the actions and all of the business engagements we're going to undertake, we're going to hold ourselves internally to those very, very high commitments.
Thank you. Professor Lee, a few questions for yourself. You mentioned in your opening comments the idea of competitive advantage. I love that. I'm a trade lawyer by profession. Not enough people supporting free trade these days. What in your view, are areas that Canada has competitive advantage in?
Thank you. Excellent question. One we don't seem to talk about very much are services, and more specifically, banking. I am a former banker. I do not consult and have any investments in the banks, but I do believe that the six large Canadian banks are some of the strongest and most powerful banks in the world. It is not an accident that the German banks, who are very good, or the American, or the British, or the French, haven't come to Canada. And there's a reason, because they are really, really good. And so there's one area. We have very strong expertise in consulting, especially in housing and financial services. So I don't think it's in the manufacturing sector. I think it's in this, at least in terms of autos and airplanes. And there's good evidence for that. But we certainly are very strong in services and, of course, natural resources and energy.
The one that would come to my mind, which I think you've confirmed, is natural resources and energy. So oil and gas, minerals, that type of extractive industries. Is that right?
Exactly, exactly. Especially in critical minerals, just to get it out there very quickly. China has the United States by the throat on critical minerals. This has been well analyzed in Foreign Policy Magazine, Foreign Affairs Magazine, the Wall Street Journal. And we have enormous amounts of critical minerals, especially in Ontario and Quebec. So if there isn't some kind of a potential deal in the Cosmo agreement there, I don't know. I don't see why not.
Then is, despite having this competitive advantage in some of these industries, it seems to me that perhaps we're not taking advantage of them. What's your assessment of, are we taking advantage of the things that we are good at, or do we have things that are impeding us? And if so, what's your view on them?
I'll be very quick and blunt. I'm at the risk of offending some people. I've argued that for the last 60 years, I've used tried to be humorous, I guess. Marx talked about commodity fetishism. Well, in Canada, we've had manufacturing fetishism. We've believed that a country of 40 million can create a world-class industry, taking on the United States, the largest country in the world in manufacturing, and can take on China and Europe. We simply don't have the economies of scale, and we could not take them on without access. People say, well, how come we succeeded for the last 60 years? Because the United States gave us access to their market. Well, the moment they changed their mind, as Trump did just before Christmas, as did Lutnick, then it seems that we are not going to be able to make cars profitably because of those tariffs that he has said will be imposed.
On to Mr. Fonseca, please.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And one thing we are really good at is agri-food. And today is Agriculture Day in Canada, so we celebrate our farmers, our producers, our agri-food workers, those that work so hard to put food on the table, and we all appreciate everything that they do. And on that, my question will go to Mr. Harvey. You know, I was in my riding this past week and meeting with Erie Meats. Erie Meats started as a small family business. Today, they are 1,500 employees. They export to 40 countries. They talk about how important diversification is and getting out to these different markets. So they're a lot in meat processing. But Mr. Harvey, what other opportunities within the agri-food, be it, with pulses, grains, different meats, where we have an opportunity with Indonesia?
So in Indonesia, Brian Innes from Soy Canada is going to be one of your next witnesses, and he'll be able to walk you through the soy opportunities. Cereals is also a very strong opportunity in wheat in Indonesia.
Thank you. And it's with our producers, they're always talking about opening up new markets. And I know we were talking here about how important diversification is. And yes, we've set ambitious goals to double our exports beyond the U.S. market, and that is something that with this agreement, I feel that will get us closer to that goal. With the ASEAN, within that region, just geopolitically, what does this do for us in terms of how it positions Canada?
I think it shows that Canada is taking the region seriously. I used to be a diplomat, and then I was a mining executive abroad, and the criticism that was often made of Canada is that Canadians would just fly in and out and not be there over the long term. And I think a lot of effort is going into being present in the Indo-Pacific region, and that's being noticed in the Indo-Pacific region. And these are cultures where it's very much a question of personal confidence, trust, long-term relationships. Having this environment where we're there more often, and we are working in the framework of these agreements increases that level of personal trust.
Okay, well, thank you. And what I've heard from all the witness testimony here today is everybody is on side with diversification and with the plan to increase our exports around the world beyond the U.S. market. I want to go to Mr. Easton, ask you about Atkins-Realis and the work that you do with the mining sector. So we are a mining leader, so is Indonesia. And the opportunities you see there, we just heard about services in kind of the financial sector with banking, but tell me some of the services and what you would provide through the supply chain within the mining sector.
So for sure, and I'll caveat my response with the fact that we don't do a lot of mining and extraction in our Asia business unit in that part of the world just yet. Most of our activities and expertise are across Canada and the Americas. But from an Atkins-Realis standpoint, we provide engineering integration and project management oversight. And there are incredible opportunities with Indonesia in terms of helping them bring in Western supply chain players into their mining and extractive sectors, which today has a very heavy reliance on Chinese investment. So this CIPA would provide the opportunity for Canadian firms to work as part of the Indonesian mining and extractive supply chain. If there are opportunities to set up both extraction or processing facilities, we could certainly do that. So there's lots of potential opportunity on that side of the ledger.
Okay, thank you. And to Professor Lee, good to see you again. Professor Lee, I know that we were just talking about where these opportunities lie, and where you're looking as a market that has not been developed, has not been really tapped into, as Indonesia, where we could see where we do have great expertise and opportunity, be it in agri-food, be it in mining, financial services. You brought up some of the other sectors. Is there any other sector that you can think of that where we have a real opportunity here?
My apologies for neglecting agriculture. My goodness, I grew up on a farm. I should have remembered. We have world-class competencies in agriculture, and I agree with the two witnesses. And we're world-class in mining, and we're world-class in services. So we do. This is not I'm not being pessimistic. We do have very great strengths in services and in, as I said, in mining, natural resources, and agriculture. I'm just more skeptical about manufacturing because they don't want in China or Asia or Europe 2-ton Lincoln Navigators. They drive little tiny 4-cylinder cars. And I've been to Europe over 100 times, and I've been to China since 1997. They just don't drive big vehicles over there. So those are the opportunities, and we're starting to go in that direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses, and a special thank you to Mr. Lee for taking the time to be with us today. I think all the committee members very much appreciated your comments as well. All right, we will suspend for a moment while our other witnesses come to the table. For this hour, we have with us the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart True, Senior Researcher. From the Canadian Meat Council, there's Claire. We have Madame Citeau, Vice President, International Trade, and Jorge Correa, Vice President, Market Access and Technical Affairs. From Soy Canada, Brian Innes, Executive Director. Welcome to you all. We'll start with opening remarks before rounds of questions. As you're familiar with our process, you have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Mr. True, you can start, please.
Okay. Thanks very much. It's great to be back at committee. Appreciate this. I'm a researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I'm just going to represent my views in that capacity. We have about 40 years plus of analyzing free trade and investment treaties at the CCPA, so I'm going to draw from some of the research we've done on the CEPA and on other treaties. As you've heard before this committee, the Indonesia Free Trade Agreement is unlikely to result in a ton of new two-way trade. In fact, I would say it could easily get in the way of some positive job-boosting industrial strategies in both countries. I'll mention that in a second. The CEPA establishes top-shelf investment protections while backtracking on human rights, labor rights, and environmental protection in recent trade agreements. One of the most concerning aspects of the CEPA, from our perspective, is its investor-state dispute settlement process of the kind denounced by governments, by lawyers, and civil society groups globally for interfering with the achievement of human rights and climate policy. Investment treaties and trade deals with ISDS generally do not do what governments say they're going to do. They do not increase investment flows. There's no evidence of that, or very little evidence. They do not make it more likely that investments will be successful. They do not depoliticize cross-border investment disputes. In fact, sometimes they can ratchet up the politics in it. They do not provide investors with speedier access to justice, as cases can drag on for years. And they don't provide a level playing field for investors either, because arbitration panels often rule in different and contradictory ways on similar matters of law. So in that last sense, ISDS does not bring the rule of law to countries where legal systems are not as developed as they are in Canada. It simply complicates their governments and our ability to govern foreign investment. And it saddles governments with debt when companies use ISDS to sue for hundreds of millions of dollars and often billions of dollars. Canada is currently being sued by an Australian mining magnate behind the Grassy Mountain open pit coal mine in Alberta. They're using the ISDS process in the CPTPP. The Australian investors are seeking, from what I understand, at least $2 billion from the federal government. Canada is also stuck in an ISDS claim from an American investor related to a planned liquefied natural gas terminal in Quebec. They're looking for $1 billion at least in that case. That was the result of an environmental assessment that said we shouldn't move forward with that project. The economics aren't there, and it would violate Indigenous cultural rights. Indonesian environmental and economic justice groups are opposed to this agreement, in part because of this big risk to communities opposing large-scale mining. The people on the island of Sanghi, for example, have been engaged in a long struggle to prevent Canadian firm Baru Gold from commencing industrial gold mining operations. The community celebrated in 2023 when the Supreme Court in Indonesia revoked a production permit for the mine. But of course, things didn't end there. The mining company sought a partnership with a local mining firm owned by President Subianto's younger brother, and have paid some recent land taxes, and now they're hoping they can get it back on track while the community continues to resist the project. If the community is successful, right, and stopping this project as they hope, were the CEPA to be in place, the company would have a right to sue Indonesia for, again, billions of dollars, even if no shovels had been put in the ground for lost future profits. This is a kind of case that just happens all the time in ISDS, and it's surprising that we continue to sign these treaties. We do it for the mining industry. I mean, it's clear from the What We Heard documents on the Indonesia CEPA, it's clear from the government's summary of the negotiated outcomes that ISDS is in there for the mining sector. The views of labor and human rights groups on the prevalence of forced labor and human rights violations in Indonesian supply chains, for example, are barely reflected. In fact, the government walks back advances on labor protections supported by workers in more recent trade agreements like the one with Ukraine and in the CUSMA. The same goes for environment chapter, which is more or less useless, I would say. Only recurring incidents of a government relaxing or waiving laws or rules to attract investment and in ways that directly relate to trade with Canada. Only in that case can you file a dispute from the environment chapter. Our federal and provincial governments are already arguably violating this provision. because across the country we are waiving and relaxing environmental rules in order to attract foreign investment into fossil fuel and mining projects. Canada's trade minister said last week that it's not Canada's business to tell Indonesia how to protect the environment, or vice versa. Maybe that's true. But this agreement does exactly that for the regulation of e-commerce and digital trade. It does that for food safety. It does it for industrial policy, the regulation of services, and the list goes on. That's what these agreements do. On digital trade, the agreement reinforces U.S. bullying tactics that benefit mainly U.S. big tech companies, online payments firms, streaming, social media, AI giants, and other e-commerce giants. I don't know why we're doing this, to be honest. These are U.S.-made rules based on input from big tech in the United States, and here we are just reproducing them in trade agreements like with Indonesia, when citizens and businesses in both countries are demanding more from their governments in terms of regulating the activities of these companies for privacy protection, for competition reasons, and so on and so forth. So just to sum up, the presence of ISDS and CIPA, the absence of strong protections for workers and the planet make this a last-generation trade deal. Is this the best we can do, is my question for the committee. By the government's own numbers, this is going to increase 0.012% to Canada's GDP. We're looking at low hundreds of millions of dollars in increased trade. Fast-tracking ratification will not save the economy, in other words. It's not going to stick it to Trump. The agreement does not suggest a rupture, but a continuity with a fading rules-based order designed by and for powerful corporations. I do want to end by saying I congratulate members on this committee of numerous parties for pushing for a more democratic trade policy. And I would just encourage you to keep doing that. We need more parliamentary role in how these agreements are shaped. Otherwise, they're just going to keep looking like this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cho. On to Madame Citeau or Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Jorge Correa, as the Madam Chair just introduced me, at the Canadian Meat Council, the voice of Canada's federally licensed meat industry, known as CMC. I'm joined by my colleague, Claire Citeau. She's in Thailand and Singapore right now in the Canada-Asia conference. CMC is the largest component of the food processing sector with over $32 billion in annual sales and nearly 300,000 jobs across the country. Our members process more than 90% of Canada's meat, supplying Canadian families and over 90 export markets with safe, high, and quality protein. The Canadian Meat Council supports the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, CIPA, as a significant step toward growing Canadian meat exports to large, fast-growing Indo-Pacific market. This agreement will enhance our industry competitiveness and open new avenues for expansion. Indonesia, with its population of $279 million and GDP nearly $1.9 trillion, offers significant potential for the Canadian meat exporters. All our major competitors in the meat sector around the world have viable access today. CMC has worked closely with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency on planned audits and science-based market access, including the recent audit of 9 beef and pork establishments, which marks an important advance in strengthening Canada's trade relationship with Indonesia. These efforts demonstrate the value of a strong industry-government collaboration, but they also underscore that the real test of the FTA will be whether negotiated access translates into practical, commercially viable access for Canadian processors. To fully leverage the opportunities provided under the CIPA, it is essential to secure timely, predictable conditions on the ground, including recognition of halal certification, plant listing, and food safety requirements. CMC looks forward to hearing more very soon on further access improvements and to continuing to work with Parliament and federal partners to ensure that this agreement delivers tangible benefits for Canada's meat sector, its workers, and the communities it supports. I will stop there, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, sir. On to Mr. Innes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and merci au committee pour l'invitation aujourd'hui. I'm here representing Canada's soybean industry, Soy Canada includes seed developers, farmers, exporters, and processors, and we grow soybeans all the way from the Atlantic to the Rockies. They're Canada's third most valuable crop, and we exported about $3.7 billion worth of soybeans, soy meal, and soy oil in 2024. We produce world-leading food-grade soybeans in Canada to make things like tempeh and tofu and soy milk, as well as commodity soybeans that are crushed to make meal to feed animals and oil for humans and biofuels. And with more than 70% of what we produce here in Canada exported, our industry really values the opportunity to improve market access through trade agreements like the Canada-Indonesia agreement. So before I describe why Canada and Indonesian trade is important, I'd like to share a little bit about the region and why the whole region is also important for us. From a soybean perspective, the Indo-Pacific is the beating heart of global demand. And if you take ASEAN as a region as an example, they import approximately $9 billion worth of soybeans into the ASEAN countries. We export about 500 million of that 900 billion from Canada, and with lots of growth happening in the region, we see lots of opportunity to bring more wealth to Canada from what we can do really well here. Zooming in on Indonesia, for those who've been, you know that soy is a staple of the Indonesian diet, whether it's in tempeh or tofu or soy milk. In fact, it's the world's second largest soy market, the country with the second largest soy food market in the world. And for Canada, this is one of our top markets. We export about $200 million worth of soybeans every year, and it's a market that we see growing with lots of opportunity to diversify and bring more value back here to Canada. So the question that's facing us today is how this agreement can bring more opportunity to Canada. For Canada's soybean sector, we see this as a real opportunity to take a step forward to provide more predictability by eliminating tariffs, as well as providing new disciplines and new areas for collaboration around non-tariff barriers. First, eliminating tariffs helps to create growth opportunities and predictability. Today, Indonesia could raise their tariffs on Canadian soybeans to 27% at any time. We're all too familiar with how tariffs have been fluctuating lately. So the agreement will help eliminate tariffs and create predictability going forward. Second, the agreement will help address non-tariff barriers, like issues related to sanitary and phytosanitary measures in plant health. These issues can appear suddenly, create costs, and create challenges that stop our exports. One thing to highlight to the committee is Chapter 20 that covers bilateral dialogues on priority matters. This creates a new mechanism to resolve issues cooperatively between government officials. And for the soybean sector and the grain sector more broadly, the establishment of a bilateral dialogue on sanitary and phytosanitary issues signed in Jakarta in December of 2024 is particularly important. We're eager to see our Canadian government make use of this dialogue to promote the adoption of science-based residue limits. It's an area where we see increasing trade risk, and we hope our government follows through on this opportunity, the MOU signing, and the negotiation to make this new dialogue useful. So in Canada, our soybean industry is part of an agri-food ecosystem that helps give the world the food and feed that it needs. Our agri-food sector is an engine of growth for Canada, but also of critical value to Indonesia and other countries in the region that depend on imports for food and feed security. So merci beaucoup pour l'occasion à partager nos prioritaires et comment l'accord peut...
Thank you for the chance to share our priorities and explain how our sector functions.
6 minutes.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Chers invités, bonjour. Merci d'être ici.
Hello, Madam Chair, dear guests, welcome. I come from the Beauce region. It's a rural area of the country, so agriculture is very important for our region's economy. My question is for the Canadian Meat Council, for Mrs. CIIT. In the last agreements, and I did mention this recently, non-tariff barriers remain an issue for agriculture, whether this be for CETA and ECPA, now other agreements. Do you believe that this trend will continue?
Je vais répondre à ça.
Yes, I can answer that. At this time, when we come to agreements with governments, we identify the existing non-tariff barriers. And at that time, in this case, we believe that there are a number of tariffs that we could speak to in both sectors, that is pork and beef, that do worry us. But I think that we're working well with the governments. The other governments are making efforts in order to work with these non-tariff barriers. For the time being, I believe that we have a major opportunity to see a viable trade for the time being. However, we are continuing to work on this. So in beef, it's about a $10 billion export. Am I mistaken on those numbers? Yes. Yes, it's 10 billion. And if you look at the former agreements, because I'm wondering about these new trade agreements being put forward, we have not yet solved the issues contained in the former agreements regarding non-tariff barriers. So how much beef do you intend to export under CEPA compared to what is actually being exported?
Okay, I will, je vais répondre à ça aussi, là.
I'll also answer this.
Il y a une grosse opportunité en Asie.
I think there is a major opportunity for ASEAN. It's for beef, it's 5 billion, and pork, it's 3.5 billion as well. And there is an opportunity. We're already present in the ASEAN countries. And we're very important in the Philippines. And that is a new market. We have just concluded a few years back an agreement, but we've been able to take advantage of these markets. As well, there are opportunities between Thailand and us, and currently with Indonesia. I think diversification is required. In the Indo-Pacific, we are seeing a major opportunity to do this. But all of this is aimed at developing a new market. As I mentioned, that is an excellent idea. But if you look at the agreement with Indonesia, a number of producers are speaking to the obligation to reside for 4 months in Canada. Why does Indonesia impose that obligation? It's about standards. I believe that our safety standards are extremely high here. So why is that being imposed on us? Well, perhaps underlying this is that they're not familiar with our integration with the United States. So there's a major integration between our live animals and the meat production that we have between our two countries. So for us, that is something that has to be explained. We've raised the top with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and I think that a number of issues will be settled with respect to that to enable us to continue exporting as we do. That is, when we export live animals, for example, when they come from the United States. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're all in favor of developing new markets. But in terms of your exports on a percentage basis, how much is sent to the United States? Approximately. I would say chilled pork is 35%, chilled beef, it's 70%. So it's about 50% of all total exports around that are sent to the United States. So we're currently reviewing CUSMA. Are there any concerns that you have about this? Absolutely. In the past few years, we've seen free trade with the United States. We have become very integrated in the supply chain.
C'est très inquiétant.
It's very worrisome. We are working extensively with our American counterparts as well as with our counterparts in Mexico to ensure that we can pursue a viable trade relationship with them and the United States Do you believe that this should be a priority by the current government to negotiate this trade agreement quickly to make sure that it can renew it as quickly as possible? Claire, would you like to answer? I think so. I think it's important to ensure that the agreement be renewed. Our main objective is to ensure that the terms and measures currently exist that enable us to trade with the United States and Mexico, in large part without tariffs, remain intact. We're currently negotiating with the government's negotiators, and we undertake regular visits to Washington. And we also have close collaboration and discussions with our Mexican counterparts. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. It's always very pleasant to see you and to hear you. I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking questions again to underscore that today is Canada Agriculture Day and to underscore how important this is. And I'm very proud of this because I come from a dairy farm in the Lower St. Lawrence region. It is something that is very important to me. As well, I'd like to underscore that my parents' dairy farm where I was raised was one of the very first in Quebec to become entirely organic. So it's very important for us. We have 200 family farms in Canada. It's an agricultural sector in 2025 that produced $150 billion. So it's 7% of Canada's GDP. So agriculture is extremely important. We're aware of this. So thank you for being with us today. Mr. Innes, my first question is for you. You spoke to the uncertainty of American policies, the risk for Canadian soya producers, and the important strategic this holds in the Indo-Pacific agreements. I have two questions. This is an opportunity for soya producers, but which market does the Indo-Pacific market currently provide? What are the most promising outlooks for the Canadian soya market? And also, what are the tools and legislative frameworks, the trade instruments that would facilitate this? Thank you very much for this question. First of all, Indonesia is one of the most important markets in the Indo-Pacific region and for the world for our soya exports. And even for Quebec producers who export about 80% of their soya, and overall Canada, it's about 70%. These are exports specifically to the large Indo-Pacific markets, such as Indonesia. These are markets where we're seeing a great deal more value. There's more value, there's a greater quantity. It means that when the society changes, their food preferences change as well. When I was there last year twice with our exporters and with our producers, we spoke about our clients, with our clients, and we spoke about the demand that is rising. That is where they're seeing greater demand for non-OGM soya. So now we export OGM soya and also non-OGM soya to Indonesia. We identify where there's greater value and more quantity. There's a second part to your question. So when we've looked at Chapter 2 of the agreement, that is the section of biotechnology, it's important for our producers and for our sector to adapt innovation here in Canada. These trade agreements are useful because they establish a means for our government officials to dialogue, to speak, and to prevent possible risks having to do with non-tariff barriers that derive from technologies such as biotechnologies. The agreement provides for these instruments in Chapter 2 covering biotechnology. We also have Chapter 20, which is the safety and phytosafety measures. So we see this agreement as being important because it is the most that we can do right now to assist our sectors. Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. You mentioned the political uncertainty that we're seeing in the United States, and that's a major risk for your industry. So how can this Indo-Pacific Agreement contribute to tampering down this risk? Well, I've been to Indonesia twice in the past year. But when we were there, we heard the Indonesian viewpoint, that is how they view There are options. And in the soya world, our options are Canada and the United States and South America. So when I was speaking with our clients, I was told that yes, we want to work with Canada, but there's a lot of pressure coming upon us from the United States as well. But for us in the Canadian sector, it's important to have options worldwide, and it's important for us to be able to count on a more stable option, such as the one we see in Indonesia. Given that the United States is pressuring Indonesia, it's very important to demonstrate that Canada is serious in its relationship with Indonesia, though we're far away from other sides of the world, but it is important, and it's important for them to be able to provide with our products and also for our industry to see success here in Canada. Thank you. So let's speak about long-term investments and investments in infrastructure. If we want to strengthen the supply chain in the industry, we want to see tariff stability and predictability. How can this be part of investments that could be made on the long term? Well, when we look at the soya world infrastructure, we're exporting our products from the east, from the west, whether this be Montreal, Prince Rupert, elsewhere. Our ports are very important, and right now we're seeing the Contrecoeur expansion at that port. It's very important, enabling us to expand our ability to export in containers, not only to export, but to import as well. So we have the soy industry that exports using containers because we have empty containers that come in and we're able to fill them with soya and then we can send them. So we're seeing this capacity. We're looking at it, our rail capacity, even if it's only Montreal, Toronto, this is very important. The rail links are important. It's also important to have the ports being functional to be able to maintain that capacity. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before the committee today, and thank you for your presentations. So, Mr. True, I think you've made a number of comments, so we've often heard this. The times that you've appeared before this committee, you've said that the recurrent problems is that there is insufficient protection for workers and insufficient environmental protection. There is the problem as well of the ISDS. Now, I don't think that we ever heard you speak about the digital aspect when it comes to the CIPA agreement. Could you perhaps elaborate on that? Because that is something I think that is new for us. It's the issue about how our exchange will increase this, and it's very minor. What about digital trade?
Put this on. Sorry.
Oui, c'est bon.
Yes, my question is about digital trade. If I may, Madam Chair, could I perhaps start over? Well, what I was saying is that you said a number of things today with respect to the agreements, and this is the usual criticisms that we hear that I agreed with about the ISDS, environmental protection, workers' rights, etc. But in the case of digital trade, that is new. It's the first time that I heard this mentioned with respect to this agreement. This was not at all spoken about. So how do we foster? So what happens with the large digital corporations? How do they work with this agreement? I apologize for that. Well, I'll be answering in English.
The one that was put into the USMCA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, on the request of the United States government, on the request of big tech companies, Silicon Valley companies. The three most problematic aspects are probably the restriction on requiring that data be stored locally, the hard restriction on any barriers to the cross-border flows of information, and the restriction on accessing source code from certain products that you put on the market. Basically, you see how the algorithm works and so on and so forth. We believe that these three elements are unnecessary. They don't add any more than our services chapters and agreements in terms of protecting Canadian investment, but they do get in the way of regulating the activities of tech companies. And they're there to expand the monopoly powers of these U.S. firms. And so it's confusing why we would include them in a deal with Indonesia when we didn't come up with this language. It doesn't benefit our companies, and it's going to undermine Indonesian industrial policy with respect to digital services.
Intéressant, je vous remercie pour ça.
Thank you very much. Now, with respect to the other problematic provisions that you mentioned, in the case of the ISDS, that is a section in the law It is not something that we can simply approve. I think we would have to reject that section once we do the clause-by-clause study. At least that's what I intend to do. That is what I do with respect to each trade agreements. Even though I agree, I always vote against this particular article. Now, the workers' rights, and again, you were at the press scrum when we spoke about this, the 251, with respect to forced labor. The legislation has not yet passed. It has not yet been seen by Parliament. Now, for the environment, there are all kinds of issues that have been raised. We're in favor of trade, but we need to also implement measures to protect human beings and the environment. So how can we flesh this out a bit more to make sure that it is not simply an open bar?
I mean, for labor, I think there's different issues with environment and labor. I think with environment, it does get a little, it gets a little trickier, right? There are international forums for talking about this, labor standards, for environmental standards. For labor, I think we should be moving in the direction of enforceable clauses. I mean, if we're going to sign a trade agreement and we're concerned about the rights of Canadian mining companies in Indonesia, I'm not sure why we're not concerned about the rights of the workers working at those mines and those sites. We do know there's a lot of forced labor in, for example, Indonesian shrimp industry. We do know that as a result of this trade deal, potentially we'll be importing more shrimp in some areas, some shrimp products, for example. And we know that we've seen examples like in the USMCA where there's a rapid response labor mechanism where you can, based on petitions, go in and actually sort out labor violations directly at the facility, at the plant level. We'd like to see those kinds of things expanded. And of course, dealing with due diligence legislation would be helpful as well, right? So there was a way to hold Canadian companies accountable when they're involved in those activities, willingly or not, in other countries.
Donc, cette redevabilité, donc là, ça nous remène finalement.
So there's this accountability. It brings us back to the debate on the company's ombudsman. Does it not?
Sorting this out before we just continue signing more trade deals like this. The environmental provisions are, like I said, unenforceable, except in a very limited case that really doesn't exist, and no governments ever pursue these dispute settlement processes. And for labor, from what I read, there is no dispute settlement process for the labor chapter.
Mais est-ce que, par exemple, dans ces accords,
But for instance, in these particular agreements, and as you've mentioned, often there is protection for multinationals compared to others. For example, mining companies can sue the government because it has withdrawn from a project because the local community refused to accept it. But there is nothing to protect workers. If their rights were to be infringed by multinationals, should we not explicitly incorporate something in the agreement to that effect?
We should be incorporating strong enforcement mechanisms. In this case, there are the rules. There are requirements that you have to abide by certain International Labour Organization treaties, for example, on not interfering with bargaining, for example. There is a clause in there on forced labor and trying to eliminate it, but there's no way for Canada to actually help Indonesia to enforce that. And there are trade-based mechanisms we know of, like the rapid response mechanism, that can do that. And I think we should be entertaining some of those more hands-on ways, right? Of putting our, the agreement puts its finger on the scales, right? For some companies, I think we need to be realizing that we can do that in a similar way, and it would be good. I'm sure Indonesia might be open to that as well, because they're interested in enforcing the ILO conventions as well. So this is not something just us forcing this on the Indonesians.
Thank you very much, sir. On to Mr. Mantle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, witnesses, for appearing at committee and providing valuable testimony. Mr. True, for my first couple questions directed at yourself. You mentioned in your opening statements lack of transparency in negotiations and trade negotiations in general. Could you give me your assessment of the government's level of transparency with respect to this Indonesian trade proposal?
Thanks for the question. I think in general process, they followed the same process they do for most trade agreements. There is the decision that they want to negotiate a deal, and then there's the kind of tabling of the notifications and whatnot, and then all of a sudden there's the mandate that is tabled and so on. There was transparency in the sense of there were briefings for a short period of time. These were over the phone with interested stakeholders. Those were ended when I think some of the information got released to the media. And so the government changed it and went to just written briefings. But essentially, these are one-way relays of information on how the negotiations are going. At no point besides the request for consultations, request for feedback, is there any opportunity for civil society groups or members of parliament, for that matter, to affect the shape of the agreement? You know, it's just, should we do this? What are the barriers in Indonesia? And then the government puts out a what we heard document, which in a lot of cases just ignores some of the material brought forward by labor organizations, environmental groups. Certainly with a recent tabling of the what we heard in the CUSMA review, I don't even understand what happened there. They heard a lot about rapid response, labor. This is what the United States want to talk about, right? This is what USTR Greer wants to talk about, is improving the rapid response mechanism. Nothing. It's just absent from the Canadian document, even though most labor unions put in comments on it, CCPA put in comments on it. So we're a little curious as to how that document in the CUSMA context looks the way it does, yeah.
So I'm glad you brought up the what we heard report for the CUSMA review. You'll probably be familiar, it's a bit of an issue for me, transparency in that review. And in fact, this committee has made a production order for all of the comments that were submitted in the 2024 review and the 2025 review, and so far the government has failed to respond to that order, which is a matter of privilege, which may be raised in the future if it's not addressed. Did I understand your response correctly that you made comments in the USMCA CUSMA review, and those are not reflected in the government's curated report?
That's correct. They are reflected in between the lines in some areas, like where they talk about rules of origin, but they don't quite reflect some of the positions that were brought up by us and others on how those rules could be tightened. There is little mention at all of labor. So yes, that's correct, yeah.
So, I mean, just an honest question, what is the government afraid of? I mean, in other countries, in the U.S., for example, all the submissions are public. You can go online right now and download any submission that was made to USTR. You can watch the public hearings that were held. What's the government afraid of?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know what their strategy is with this particular document. One other thing I'll just say about it is it looks like a list of proposals for renegotiating the agreement that were brought forward by business. So the government is saying that we're not here to renegotiate, we're here to review. And yet the document presented makes it look like they're going to present a bunch of things that are there to renegotiate the deal. So that was another thing I don't quite understand about it.
Do you think it would be a good idea for those submissions to be made more public, so that you or other NGOs or people who are interested in these matters could see what Canadians think about these issues and respond to them?
I do think it should be a public process, and I think if people went into it expecting that their submissions will be made public, they would submit accordingly. There are other avenues for businesses and others to make their opinions known to members of parliament, but through this process, I don't see any harm in making all of the submissions public.
Thank you for that, Mr. True. Mr. Innes, I just have about 50 seconds left. Question to you. Exports are obviously a huge market, the vast majority of your market for soy in Canada. Are you concerned about becoming a target or perhaps a pawn in some of the negotiations or geopolitics that are going on, specifically with our new best friend, China?
Thanks for the question. Agriculture and food, and soy in particular, has been political recently, but for many, many years. Our sector has experienced that. What I would say is we're always concerned about that. The fundamentals of us producing way more than Canadians can eat, and that our customers needing to import food, whether it's China or elsewhere, don't change, regardless of which direction the geopolitical wind is changing. The way our sector looks at it is we need options. We need options for when the uncontrollable happens, so that we can pivot and provide people the food they need to eat in the countries that want to deal with Canada.
You have 20. Oh, sorry. I was making sure you got all your time. Yeah, I know. Well, I giving us the extra few minutes. Mr. Navke, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank all our presenters for being here. Mr. Innes, I'll start with you. China was brought up. I've been asking questions around the broader Southeast Asia region as well. As you know, Canada is also negotiating agreements with Thailand and Philippines. with ASEAN countries as a whole, which is I think, fourth or fifth largest economic bloc in the world. What does these agreements mean for the soy industry, and what are your views and engagement has been with GAC officials on those agreements and negotiations?
Yeah, so starting with the opportunity in the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN, we see incredible opportunity for growth in volume and growth in value. So when we think about soybeans, we're not just selling one type of soybeans. In fact, we're selling hundreds of different gradients of soybeans where we create bespoke varieties that make certain kinds of tofu for certain manufacturers. We sell different soybeans for tempeh and different for soy milk and different for animal feed. So when you look out in the fields, they may all look the same, but in fact, we're sending hundreds of different products to different customers around the world. And to look at food-grade soybeans as an example, our producers make 50% more out of those soybeans relative to commodity soybeans. So when we look at the options in the Indo-Pacific, there's lots of opportunity to increase volume, increase value as those markets grow and people have more income and are more discernible in their choices. When we think about the agreements in Thailand, in Indonesia and ASEAN, as well as Philippines, all of them are major importers of vegetable protein and vegetable oil. And so we see opportunities to grow exports in all of those. And we would hope that the template established with the Canada-Indonesia agreement around sanitary and phytosanitary measures, as well as biotechnology, as well as looking at how we deal with plant health issues, can be replicated in other agreements like Philippines and like Thailand.
Do you have estimates as to what kind of growth in production and profits for our farmers you see if these agreements are signed?
It's a great question. It's hard to see the future, especially one that's so uncertain at the moment. But what I can share is that we need options to export. And the more options we have, the more value and the more flexibility and the more ability we have to pivot when geopolitical situations change. And so it is about growing value, it is about growing options, but it's also about how we manage risk. And for our producers who manage the risk of too much rain, not enough rain, late frost, early frost, too much heat, not enough heat, the ability to help manage risk in the trade environment when we export so much is also important.
I recently met representatives of Pulse Canada, and very similar conversation we were having with them in terms of opportunities to grow Canadian market in Asian countries. And there was two points that came clear to me. One, of course, the quality of our product that has a premium and is sought after compared to other competitor countries, and wonder if the same for soy. And second is the value add, the processing side, which is sort of the new frontier, so to speak, where you're just not selling the raw seeds, but there's actually more processing and production happening here. That means more jobs. Is that similar you're seeing within your crop, and what does that mean in relation to these agreements?
First thing I'd start is to share, when we travel overseas, and to have just returned from a 3-country trip with 25 of our farmers and exporters, what we hear from our customers is they value what Canada provides. And for us, that's quality, sustainability, and trust. And they don't get that from every country in the world right now. And so there is a real opportunity for Canada to seize the moment that our customers are experiencing to provide high-quality, sustainable, and trusted food. On the value-added side, there are certainly opportunities, and we want to see that grow. One example I would share is a dried soy milk powder plant just south of Ottawa in Morrisburg. It's a new plant coming on stream with a partnership with a Japanese company. And that's an opportunity to further process our soybeans and to be able to export more of a food ingredient than the soybeans. But I would also say that when we think about value-added, we want to have factories, but the choices that the farmer has also represent many gradients of value added. And I use the example of food-grade soybeans, where our farmers make 50% more per bushel than they do off commodity soybeans. They take extra work, and it takes extra care throughout the whole chain to create a bespoke variety and keep it separate and test it and keep it pure. But there are opportunities to add value, including what the farmer does and the value chain, as well as in a factory.
40 seconds.
40 seconds, very quickly. Mr. Correa, similar question. What are these opportunities look like for the meat sector when it comes to these Southeast Asian countries?
Huge. So we're talking about countries like Indonesia, where we have no access at all in the beef and pork, and they import $1.1 billion in beef. Okay. So this is huge opportunity for the beef side. In terms of the other countries, we know Thailand, we're looking for an FTA with Thailand. Thailand also is a big importer of beef, not as much of pork because they produce a lot. And then Philippines, huge market for Canada.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Oui, alors, pour continuer sur ce volet, puis...
So to continue on this segment, I'm very happy to see that sectors will be the winners in the sector, and I'm very pleased to see that. However, as Mr. True said, I think that we need to establish stricter boundaries and stricter provisions in place. It's fine to do trade, but not at any price, not at the expense of the planet or human beings. So, Mr. True, I'd like to ask you this, if I may. Are you worried about deforestation over there? Because there are warlords, there are some industries that are causing deforestation. There was a huge hole in the forest in Indonesia that's the size of Belgium. Is this something you're concerned with? Should we find a way of incorporating a stricter mechanism in the agreement on this?
Ways to factor these things into our trade agreements. We should not be importing products that were that were produced as a result of deforestation, for example. I don't know if we've kind of found out the exact way to do that. I mean, I'm concerned about deforestation in Canada as well. And I'm concerned also about the extent to which we talked about investor state. If I can use this opportunity just to say that one of the risks in Canada from this treaty would be to put Canadian forestry policies at risk of disputes from forestry companies as well, which are, as we know, the largest one in Canada, owned by Indonesian investors. And so, yeah, I am concerned, but I don't know exactly how we go about fixing that problem.
Mais par rapport au règlement des différents investisseurs États, j'imagine que vous invitez les députés ici à rejeter cet article-là quand on fera l'article par article cette semaine?
Oui, absolument.
Yeah, you have 40 seconds.
Écoutez, en 40 secondes, qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire d'autre? Avez-vous d'autres recommandations sur comment on pourrait améliorer le projet de loi?
Ben, pas vraiment. Pour nous, c'est la matière, c'est ici, c'est le règlement des différences qui est that's the biggest problem with this treaty. I appreciate the opportunities, for example, that our soy farmers are going to achieve.
Thank you very much,
tariffs.
Mr. True. Mr. Cram for 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Innes, I'd like to start with you because you said that your members expect to benefit from this free trade agreement, and I certainly hope that they do. I was a bit surprised to read that when Global Affairs Canada first announced that they were beginning free trade negotiations with Indonesia, that was way back in June of 2021. And this deal did not come up for a vote in the House of Commons until just last week. So I certainly hope that it becomes law before we reach the 5-year anniversary, but it still has to go through the Senate. It still has to receive royal assent. So I was wondering if you could offer any advice as to how we can move faster when it comes to free trade agreements with new and emerging markets, because it seems that 5 years is a long time to wait.
Over my 20 years' experience in trade agreements, I've seen many iterations of how it can roll out. And I would offer that I think Parliament and Committee has a really important role with the processes that have evolved lately. And in that, I would draw the example of Indonesia, where the substantial conclusion, I believe, was more than a year and 3 months ago. And why did it take a year and 3 months for it to get tabled in Parliament and get to committee. Those things are all in the control of the Canadian government. Yes, we have elections. Yes, we have parliamentary sessions. But it's not clear to me why it took so long either. So I would certainly share your view that controlling things that we can control within Canada, within Parliament, within committee, to put agreements once they've been agreed and legal scrubbed and all of that towards Parliament sooner would be a helpful aspect. So that's one thing I've seen with the Indonesia agreement, that indeed through CAFTA and through Soy Canada, we've been recommending that it come before Parliament as quickly as possible after conclusion.
And do you have any speculation as to the answer as to why it took a year and 3 months to get tabled in Parliament?
I don't have visibility into that.
Okay, that's very fair. In addition to having these deals on paper, it's important to have the infrastructure in place so that we can export our products far and wide. And you mentioned ports in an answer to an earlier question. I was wondering if you could share with the committee your members' experiences with the Port of Vancouver in particular, about how your members have experienced exporting through that particular port and improvements that could be made.
Yeah. So on the Port of Vancouver, it's important for agriculture products and soybeans from Western Canada, but it is also important for soybeans produced in Eastern Canada. So soybeans produced in Ontario and Quebec, headed towards the Indo-Pacific or Asia more broadly, do transit by rail to Vancouver to be loaded in container ships and sent to their destination. So when we look at the system, it's about the Port of Vancouver, but it's also about the two railways and the power that they exert on the whole system to get our product from inland to the Port of Vancouver. So our experience broadly on transportation is that we have work to do in Canada. We have work to do in how our railways respond to the needs of the country and our needs, particularly as a soybean industry, to access opportunities through them to the ports, through the container ships, and to the customers. For the Port of Vancouver, we're happy to see opportunities to expand container capacity. What we see globally in places that use the container system is that systems with capacity that encourage imports also enable exports. And so the more capacity we have through Roberts Bank 2, for example, to expand container capacity will be helpful for our agricultural exports in containers. Overall, the Port of Vancouver is part of a system, and I would say hasn't been the biggest challenge for us.
And 50 seconds, okay. And okay, so you also mentioned railways, and what in the time that we have left, can you offer any recommendations that could improve railway policy to make sure that what farmers produce gets to global markets faster?
Yes. So we recognize that as publicly traded companies, they have responsibilities to their shareholders, but we also believe that as two railways in Canada that have significant market power and ultimately control what we can sell, that they also respond to the needs of the country. And that comes in terms of rates and service. And an example I would share with you is that oftentimes all of the things get downloaded onto our industry. So when we deliver a container of soybeans to a container terminal in Toronto, how much time that trucker waits in the terminal is entirely determined by the railway. They don't pay for it. Ultimately, it comes out of the farmer's pocket, and what we have to back off in terms of what our customers provide for the product at the end.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ennis. On to Madame Lapointe, please, for the last speaker.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Thank you very much for being here. These topics are very interesting. Mr. True, earlier you spoke about safety rules for workers. We heard a witnesses earlier who mainly spoke about these major projects and who indicated that these safety rules were similar at the very least, very interesting compared to our own safety rules, because you mentioned that the safety rules covering all of those working, you said that these were quite different. I'd like to hear you speak to this, because the earlier witness said that he was very pleased to see that the people working on the major projects had to wear the same safety equipment as they do here in Canada.
I might say, but I think what they were saying was that when they go and operate abroad, they take their own practices with them, right? So they would obviously not want to treat workers badly or undermine health and safety and so on and so forth. And the Indonesian rules are quite sophisticated from what I understand. It's a very sophisticated democracy, and they do concern themselves with these things. But there is prevalent use of forced labor across the economy. There is, like I said, in the shrimp industry for sure. We've heard terrible cases about nickel production, for example, domestic and Chinese-owned plants where workers die, right, in the hundreds, sometimes in over a couple of years. And so there's a matter of enforcement, there's a matter of what the government wants to do, and then there's a matter of the market itself compelling companies to cut costs and cut corners. And so we need to think about the ways in which increasing trade in some areas that are trade, like nickel, like shrimp, whatever, that
Ce que je comprends, c'est que c'est pas uniforme à l'intérieur du pays.
I understand that there's no consistency within the countries regarding these rules. I'm sorry, I only have 5 minutes, so I'd like to address my question to both Mr. Ines and Mr. Correa. So thank you very much. And also we have Mr. George, you indicated earlier that there were tremendous opportunities regarding meat exports. So now we're speaking about Indonesia, but could you explain to us where else you might see these opportunities? Yes, absolutely. There are opportunities outside because currently we export to more than 80 countries worldwide. We export meat to them. It's clear that there are two countries that remain that represent major opportunities. It's Thailand and Indonesia, but we don't have access to them. We know that they buy a great deal of pork and beef, but they need high quality premium meat as well. My colleague today is in Thailand, and we're having productive conversations, and there is the desire by buyers to obtain high quality beef in Thailand. Across ASEAN, there are major opportunities because we also have free trade agreements with the Philippines, and I think that would give us quite an important competitive edge compared to other competitors. Earlier, I spoke about Canadian pork and beef and our situation in Indonesia. There are only Australia and the EU, the European Union, and so we're present there. So there's a major opportunity opening up for us there. So, Mr. Enos, you spoke about soya and the opportunities. You spoke about OGM and non-OGM. I'd like to know what proportion we grow and what is our capacity in Canada to export. It appears that we could grow this. You mentioned this. We can increase the value of our products, but as well, we could grow the volumes of our exported programs. So by how much can we boost our capacity to export? Thank you for the question. Here in Canada, roughly 20% of our production is non-OGM and 80% is OGM. So generally speaking, we say that the non-OGMs are products for their food grain products, they're for animal feed and OGMs. But the non-OGMs generally, in fact, these OGMs are generally destined for animals, but in Indonesia, most of our exports are OGM for tempeh, tofu, and soya. There is customer demand, and they have a preference clearly identified. There's also biological protection for the sector. So when we see this opportunity to expand our exports, then we're seeing more opportunities to grow more soya in Western Canada. That is, we're seeing longer and warmer growing seasons. We're also seeing summers that are more changing in the prairies. There we're seeing greater opportunities for producers and family producers to choose soya more often in those areas where there's more humidity, like Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And even in the food grade products, we're seeing a sector in Manitoba that is seeing more opportunities to produce more non-OGM soya for food grade products.
To our witnesses, reminder to our committee that any amendments on C18 need to be in by 6 p.m. today. Thank you very much. We'll be doing the clause by clause on Thursday. Thank you.